At some point, almost everyone reaches the same moment of confusion. They look at their bank statements, their credit balances, their payment history, and they realize something does not add up. They followed the rules. They went to school, built experience, showed up consistently, paid on time. They avoided obvious mistakes. They cut unnecessary spending. They worked harder when things became tight. And yet, the debt never disappears. It shrinks slightly, then grows again. It stabilizes, then resurfaces. Years pass, income increases, but the obligation remains, quietly embedded in the future. This moment is usually followed by a private assumption. I must be doing something wrong. But that assumption is incorrect. What most people experience is not personal failure, it is structural exposure. For most of modern history, personal debt was temporary. It existed to bridge gaps, buying a home, starting a business, surviving a short disruption. The expectation was clear. Debt would eventually be eliminated through time and productivity. That expectation no longer matches reality. Today, personal debt behaves less like a bridge and more like infrastructure. It does not simply support life events, it shapes them. It influences where people live, what work they accept, how much risk they can tolerate, and how far into the future they can plan. This shift did not happen accidentally. It happened because the system was redesigned. The modern debt system is not optimized for resolution. It is optimized for duration. Predictable cash flow, long timelines, stable participation, behavioral compliance. In this structure, paying on time is rewarded more than paying off. Carrying a balance is normalized. Long repayment horizons soften perceived risk while maximizing total extraction. Once someone enters this system, time stops being an ally. It becomes the mechanism. What makes the current moment different is not debt itself. It is scale and timing. By the mid-2020s, personal debt in advanced economies has reached a saturation point that historically precedes systemic adjustment. Not collapse in the dramatic sense, but reset. A restructuring of rules, incentives, and outcomes. These resets never arrive with announcements. They reveal themselves gradually through subtle changes that most people misinterpret as individual problems. Rising minimum payments, stricter lending terms, programs labeled as relief that extend timelines rather than eliminate obligations. A growing gap between effort and outcome. When these signals appear together, the system is no longer expanding. It is stabilizing itself. And stabilization always comes at the expense of participants. History shows this pattern repeatedly, at the level of empires, institutions, and markets, but it also applies at the individual level, even if the language is different. Debt systems move through stages, not metaphorically, structurally. 5 stages appear again and again, regardless of country, culture, or ideology. The labels change, but the mechanics remain. Most people alive today are already deep into this cycle without realizing it. The first stage is normalization. This is where debt stops feeling exceptional. It becomes ordinary, expected, and largely invisible. Credit is framed as responsibility. Scores replace savings as markers of stability. Monthly payments become the primary metric, while total cost fades into the background. In normalization, borrowing is not questioned. It is assumed. A long repayment timeline is presented as safety. A manageable monthly number masks the true scale of obligation. People feel stable because the system feels stable. This stage is dangerous precisely because it feels harmless. Normalization quietly transfers future income into present commitments. Flexibility is exchanged for access. The trade feels rational, even necessary. At scale, normalization creates dependency. At the personal level, it creates a subtle loss of agency. The second stage is expansion. Once debt is normalized, it grows faster than income. Not primarily through reckless spending, but through structural necessity. Prices rise faster than wages. Essential costs absorb a larger share of earnings. Credit fills the gap. What once existed for emergencies begins to fund normal life. This expansion is encouraged. Offers increase. Friction decreases.
Borrowing is framed as optimization rather than risk. During this stage, most people still feel in control. Payments are manageable. Credit remains available. Life continues. But behavior begins to shift. Career choices prioritize stability over opportunity. Risk tolerance narrows. Long-term decisions become defensive. The future is quietly pre-committed. Expansion can last many years, sometimes decades, but it always leads to the same pressure point. The third stage is saturation. This is where the system tightens. Balances are high enough that interest absorbs meaningful income. Minimum payments rise. New borrowing no longer creates relief. It only preserves the current position. Effort increases. Progress slows. People describe this stage as exhaustion, the feeling of constant motion without advancement. Discipline no longer produces momentum. Even responsible behavior feels insufficient. This is the stage where many people blame themselves the most. They believe they need better budgeting, more income, more restraint. But saturation is not a behavioral problem, it is a mathematical one. At this point, the system is no longer expanding through growth. It is maintaining itself through pressure, which triggers the next stage. The fourth stage is restructuring. This stage is often misunderstood as help. Debts are consolidated, terms are extended, payments are temporarily reduced. The immediate pressure eases, and relief feels real. But structurally, something else is happening. The system is preserving continuity, not eliminating burden. Restructuring stretches obligations across longer timelines. Total cost increases. Dependency is stabilized. Participation continues. For some individuals, restructuring creates breathing room. For others, it locks in long-term exposure that becomes harder to escape. Historically, restructuring appears when a system reaches its functional limits, when default must be prevented, but elimination is impossible. It is the final adjustment before exits accelerate. Which brings us to the fifth stage, exit. Exit is not chaos. It is not necessarily default, and it is not failure. Exit is disengagement. It occurs when participants stop optimizing within the system and start repositioning outside it. When they realize that better tactics inside a broken structure do not change outcomes. Exits take many forms: strategic repayment, asset liquidation, income restructuring, geographic shifts, legal resolution, lifestyle compression. What matters is not the method, but the timing. Exits cluster around resets. By the year 2026, the conditions that historically precede mass exit are aligned. Saturation is widespread. Restructuring is accelerating. Real purchasing power continues to decline. Most people will remain inside the system, adapting to new terms. But millions will not. Not because they are reckless, not because they are lucky, but because they understand the stage. Once the stage is visible, the system stops feeling confusing. It becomes predictable. And predictability is the foundation of exit. If the first stage quietly pulls people in, and the second stage stretches the system outward, then the third stage is where the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Saturation is the point where debt stops behaving like a tool and starts behaving like gravity. At this stage, the numbers no longer shock anyone. What changes is the feeling. Payments consume a growing share of income. Interest becomes visible. Progress slows to the point where effort and outcome disconnect. People describe this stage with the same language, regardless of income level or background. They say they feel stuck. They say they are busy but not moving forward. They say they are doing everything they were told to do, yet nothing improves. This reaction is rational. In saturation, the system has reached a balance where incoming payments primarily service past borrowing rather than reduce principal. Time works, but it works slowly. So slowly that progress feels theoretical. From the outside, nothing looks broken. Accounts remain current. Credit scores often stay intact. But internally, flexibility disappears. This is the stage where debt begins to dictate life structure. Job changes feel risky, even when opportunities exist. Entrepreneurship feels impossible. Geographic mobility shrinks. Long-term planning becomes defensive rather than aspirational. People are not trapped by contracts alone. They are trapped by exposure. At scale,
Saturation is where institutions begin to notice strain, not publicly, but internally. Delinquency curves flatten and then creep upward. Growth slows, margins tighten. The response is never elimination. It is adjustment. This is where the fourth stage begins. Restructuring is often described as assistance, but structurally, it serves a different purpose. It keeps the system functioning when expansion is no longer possible. In personal debt, restructuring takes many forms: consolidation, extended repayment plans, income-based adjustments, modified terms, temporary relief programs. Each appears to offer the same promise: lower pressure now. And in the short term, that promise is often real. Payments decrease, breathing room returns, anxiety drops. The immediate crisis passes. But the underlying obligation does not shrink. It stretches. Restructuring trades intensity for duration. The burden feels lighter, but it lasts longer. Total cost increases, even as monthly stress decreases. This trade is not inherently malicious. In many cases, it prevents immediate default and preserves stability. But it also locks participants deeper into the system's long-term math. Historically, restructuring emerges when systems reach their limits, when too many participants are saturated and widespread failure would threaten the structure itself. At the national level, this looks like refinancing, austerity, or monetary intervention. At the personal level, it looks like relief programs that preserve participation. This is where a critical psychological shift occurs. Most people interpret restructuring as progress. In reality, it is stabilization. The system is no longer trying to help participants exit. It is trying to keep them inside. For some, restructuring genuinely creates a path forward. For others, it delays a reckoning while increasing total exposure. The difference is not effort, it is position. Those who eventually exit do not do so by pushing harder inside the same structure. They change structure entirely. This is the key misunderstanding in modern personal finance. Most advice focuses on optimization within the system, better budgeting, smarter repayment strategies, incremental income increases. These tools work in the early stages. They lose power in the later ones. By the time saturation and restructuring dominate, marginal improvements cannot overcome structural drag. This is why so many disciplined people feel disoriented. The rules they were taught no longer produce results. The system did not break. It moved to a new phase. This brings us to the exit stage, the most misunderstood and the most controversial. Exit is not collapse, exit is repositioning. Historically, exits appear when systems become rigid, when rules harden, when participation offers diminishing returns relative to risk. At the personal level, exits are quiet, rarely dramatic, often invisible from the outside. They begin with a shift in priorities. Instead of asking, "How do I pay this faster?" the question becomes, "How do I reduce exposure to this system entirely?" This leads to structural decisions. Income streams are altered. Assets are liquidated or repositioned. Cost structures are compressed. Geographic choices change. Legal frameworks are considered. None of this is accidental. Exit requires clarity, and clarity emerges when the stage is recognized. By the year 2026, several forces converge to accelerate exits. First, saturation becomes widespread. What once affected a minority becomes common. The sense of running in place spreads across income brackets. Second, restructuring intensifies. More programs appear. More adjustments are offered. More people are encouraged to extend timelines rather than eliminate balances. Third, real purchasing power continues to decline. Even when nominal income rises, it fails to restore flexibility. Together, these forces create a reset environment. Resets do not eliminate debt. They redistribute outcomes. Those who remain fully exposed absorb the adjustment through time, obligation, and reduced optionality. Those who exit early absorb pain up front in exchange for long-term autonomy. This is not about morality or intelligence. It is about sequence. History is clear on this point. In every major debt cycle, the majority adapts. A minority repositions. The system survives. The participants experience very different outcomes. The danger is not debt itself. The danger is misunderstanding the stage. When people treat late-stage problems with early-stage tools, frustration grows, effort increases, results stagnate. The system appears unfair, confusing, or broken. In reality, it is behaving exactly as designed. The purpose of this analysis is not to tell anyone what choice to make. It is to make the structure visible. Once the structure is visible, decisions change. In the final part, we will examine what exits actually look like in practice. Not abstract theory, but real patterns that repeat during resets. Which approaches reduce exposure, which ones fail, and why timing matters more than tactics. Because the reset is not coming. It is already forming. When people hear the word exit, they often imagine something extreme. Collapse, bankruptcy, disappearance from the system. That misunderstanding keeps most people trapped far longer than necessary. Historically, exits are rarely dramatic. They are quiet, deliberate, and misunderstood until long after they occur. An exit does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means changing the framework in which responsibility operates. To understand this, it helps to look at how exits have appeared in previous debt cycles. In every major reset, most participants remained inside the system. They adapted to new terms, longer timelines, and reduced flexibility. They survived, but with diminished autonomy. A smaller group chose a different path, not because they were reckless, but because they recognized that the structure itself had stopped serving them. They stopped asking how to perform better within the system. They asked how to reduce dependence on it. This shift is subtle, but profound. Inside the system, success is measured by compliance, payment history, optimization, stability. Outside the system, success is measured by exposure. How much future income is pre-committed? How many obligations compound over time? How resilient one's position is to systemic adjustment. Exit strategies vary widely, but they share a common logic. They prioritize structure over speed. Many people believe that escaping debt requires aggressive action, maximum income, extreme austerity, perfect timing. History suggests the opposite. The most successful exits are rarely fast. They are intentional. They begin with a reassessment of what actually matters. Cash flow over net worth, flexibility over optimization, optionality over growth. This is where most mainstream advice fails. Traditional personal finance assumes a stable system. It assumes predictable purchasing power, steady rules, and linear progress. Late-stage debt systems are not stable. Rules change, costs shift, assumptions break. In this environment, strategies that worked 10 or 15 years ago lose effectiveness. What replaces them is not a single formula, but a pattern of decisions. Income is examined not just for size, but for resilience, how vulnerable it is to disruption, how dependent it is on a single institution or geography. Assets are evaluated not for appreciation alone, but for liquidity and optionality. Expenses are not merely reduced, they are redesigned to lower fixed obligations. Geography becomes a variable. Legal frameworks become relevant. Time horizons shorten. None of this appears dramatic from the outside, but collectively these decisions reduce exposure to compounding obligation. This is what exit looks like in practice. The most common mistake people make at this stage is delay. They sense the pressure. They recognize the inefficiency, but they wait for certainty. They want confirmation, a signal, a clear announcement that the reset has begun. History offers no such announcements. By the time certainty arrives, the most advantageous exits are already gone. This is why timing matters more than tactics. Two people can make nearly identical decisions. One exits early, one exits late. The outcomes diverge sharply. Early exits absorb discomfort when options still exist. Late exits absorb pressure when options have narrowed. This pattern repeats across every debt reset in history. At the personal level, the consequences are quieter, but no less real. Longer working years, reduced mobility, permanent exposure to interest and obligation. By contrast, those who exit before the reset often appear conservative at the time, risk-averse, even pessimistic,
In hindsight, they appear prescient. The year 2026 represents a convergence point, not a deadline. By this period, several structural forces align. Debt saturation becomes normalized rather than exceptional. Restructuring programs expand rather than contract. Real purchasing power continues to erode even when nominal incomes rise. At the same time, institutional tolerance for risk decreases. Lending terms tighten. Flexibility shrinks. These conditions do not produce immediate collapse. They produce rigidity, and rigidity is what makes exits difficult. The purpose of understanding this cycle is not fear, it is clarity. Most people do not need radical action. They need correct framing. They need to stop interpreting late-stage symptoms as personal shortcomings. They need to recognize that effort alone cannot overcome structural drag. And they need to understand that exit is not an event. It is a process. A series of decisions that reduce dependence on a system that no longer rewards participation proportionally. Some people will choose to remain inside the system indefinitely. That choice is not wrong, but it should be conscious. What history punishes most severely is not participation. It is unawareness. Debt systems do not collapse overnight. They harden. They become less forgiving, less flexible, and less responsive to individual effort. Those who recognize this early retain agency. Those who recognize it late adapt under pressure. Those who never recognize it at all mistake endurance for progress. The five-stage cycle does not predict individual outcomes. It explains probabilities, and probabilities shape strategy. The most important shift is psychological. When people stop asking how to win inside the system and start asking how to reduce exposure to it, behavior changes. Risk is reassessed. Time is valued differently. Stability is redefined. This is not about escaping responsibility. It is about choosing which responsibilities are worth carrying forward. The reset will not announce itself. It will arrive quietly, through policy adjustments, market shifts, and institutional changes that feel technical and distant. But their effects will be personal. The people who fare best will not be the ones who work the hardest. They will be the ones who understood the stage and positioned themselves accordingly. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern. And once a pattern is visible, it stops being frightening. It becomes navigable.